Okay, thanks very much. Well, the starting point that I want to come from is this question. Well, in fact, the starting point that this conference began with, and what first interested me about putting forward an abstract for the conference, is this question of Marcello Mastroianni as an international icon. Because what I'd like to ask is an icon of what exactly? I don't know that that is, while it's universally accepted that he is iconic, quite what it is his figure is iconic of is perhaps more difficult to answer. I think this came up a fair bit yesterday. People were discussing the way in which he was the most, or perhaps the only, really successful male Italian star abroad. He is described by Gino Moliterno in the Historical Dictionary of Italian Cinema in the first sentence as being undoubtedly the actor who most came to represent Italian cinema in the post-war period, and by Millicent Marcus, again in Noel Smith's Companion to Italian Cinema as the first sentence, that Mastroianni has come to personify the entire evolution of post-war Italian cinema. Appra and Pistagnesi describe him as being an ambassador for Italian charm, and on the other hand, I feel we're getting to a sort of meta citation here with Jackie Reich. We now each not only need to cite her, but also mention just how often she's being cited. Jacqueline Reich, of course, as we know in the foundational work on Mastroianni, has written on page 1 that rather than self-confident, Mastroianni appears self-deprecating. Rather than heroic, he sees himself as the anti-hero. Rather than a sex symbol, he looks to others as models of masculine beauty. And what she connects this to, and very much as was being elaborated upon in the previous paper, this is connected to the result of the downfall during fascism and the post-war period. The downfall of fascism and post-war period. This is the emergence of the Veneto as the dominant cultural representation of masculinity in literature as well as the cinema, and especially in Mastroianni's films. Now, what I wanted to discuss, I called the paper Imagining Marcello. I wanted to discuss the way in which image is very important to his star persona, the way in which that image also takes on a greater life within the imagination of Italian cinema, or perhaps Italy itself, in critical and more popular discourse. And I called it Imagining Marcello. He was not someone I ever met, but just because this sense of there being some kind of personal connection is already very important in questions of star studies, but with Marcello Mastroianni seems to be particularly prominent. And the underpinning for this is an investigation into the relationship between these two ideas. On the one hand, the ambassador of Italian charm, or the representative of post-war Italian cinema, or post-war Italy itself, the very sympathetic and in many ways successful figure that at least a superficial analysis would claim for Marcello, with, on the other hand, ineptness or imperfection. So what's the relationship between those two parts of his persona? Now, in terms, and so let's move on to the next second. In terms of considering fame and heroism in a grander historical sweep, Leo Brody has written that from its beginnings, fame has promised many a solitary eminence with a chance to be separated from the crowds, but watched by them. While one's own gaze looks towards the sky, I was struck then to see the cover yesterday of the programme that we have for the conference here. In a certain way, Marcello Mastroianni seems in this image to be conforming to that notion of fame, but I think it is absolutely correct to discuss the way in which he comes across as being inadequate to heroic roles. As he said again, it was in the the brilliant video montage that we saw yesterday morning in Una Giornata Particolare. He says about how he's not marito, padre, soldato, actually said in close-up and almost really in direct address to us. He does not conform to those heroic types, as people have very much discussed. Nevertheless, one thing that Brody discusses in his historicization of fame is the way in which fame is connected to the ideal of personal freedom. The desire for fame is connected to the uncertainty of personal identity, and that the history of fame is also the history of the shifting definition of achievement in a social world. And I think that Marcello Mastroianni's image and his international success shows a changing conception of fame, in which heroic types in general are no longer quite adequate to the way in which we would like to feel a connection with famous people, but something much more personal to it. So a change there historically in what we consider the relationship of the self to the public sphere, and in the way that we consider renown and so on. And in fact, that across his work, we're invited to understand this personal aspect of Mastroianni and his failed connection to heroic types as something interesting, or something which is itself the problem. Certainly, in terms of the question of the Latin lover, that it would be superficial. I mean, it's the sort of first phrase that people come to with Mastroianni, and as many people have pointed out, that's a fairly superficial take to have on him. Nevertheless, Latin lover itself is already a playful term. It's already self-aware. It's a term which is used in its English manifestation when spoken of in Italian. It's already a sense of some self-awareness that's there. And I would like to maintain that Mastroianni, very, very generally across his work, retains a sense of the audience's sympathy and of the audience's identification. When Fellini, who, as we've already heard, collaborated a great deal with Mastroianni, when Fellini wanted an unsympathetic Casanova, he chose Donald Sutherland. He didn't choose Marcello Mastroianni. And again, this may somewhat separate me from some of the other analyses that we'll hear through the course of this conference, but I do think he stands out in relation to the other comic types, to the other comic actors that we get in post-war Italy. Someone who's much more riddled with self-doubt than the other, someone who indicates a far greater complexity of the interior life, and fundamentally not someone, this connects, I think, the question of his particularity in comic roles and the fact that he's not the action hero. Rather than being a star who is known particularly for what he does on screen, he's a star who's recognized particularly for what he seems to be on screen. So is rather than does, being very much at the fore. Now, with all of this in mind, I would like to show a brief clip from a very early Mastroianni film, 1956, La fortuna di essere donna. It's a early collaboration with Sophia Loren, directed by Alessandro Blasetti, so a creative team that was to last, particularly at the early period. It's just the very beginning credits. It's only really a few shots. And I just want to point out, firstly, this is an interest in fashion, in fame, in the paparazzi, before the word even came to mean what it meant. It's several years before La Dolce Vita. And the way in which there are three levels of fame in just these opening few shots. A group of celebrities arrive on a plane. Sophia Loren is in the crowd looking at them. Now the camera's interest is on Sophia Loren. She's the main star, and throughout the film she's the one who has far more screen time. Marcello Mastroianni comes in, his character Corrado comes in and just takes a quick snap of her. He actually makes her a star through the course of the film. They gain entry to the world of the high class, the aristocracy, but then she ends up going for Corrado, Marcello's character, the ordinary guy. So three levels of fame. There's the world of the high class, the aristocracy, the rich and famous. There's Sophia Loren, who by then at that point was the bigger star than Mastroianni, who the audience's attention is directed to. And then there's Marcello, who the audience's subject position seems to coincide with. Much as I'd love to play more of the music, I should better continue to have the lights, please. Now, he's already someone who's a figure not only of identification, but also of significant mobility. He is both Sophia Loren's and our, the spectators' route to the world of fame and to the high life, a world which he gains access to both for her himself and for us, but which he's not part of. So mobility, but also separation. Now, throughout his career, really from the early days onwards, there's a sense of some kind of achievement, of some sort of moving towards fame in Mastroianni's work. The very early film Vita da Cane, I think that's 1953, unless I'm much mistaken. He's only in it for a couple of scenes, but he's introduced as being someone, well, in fact, as a theatrical impresario says, farà strada questo giovanotto. There already seems to be this level, this kind of meta discourse about Mastroianni's coming to fame. He's someone who's not really, well, he basically plays a bourgeois character, some sort of professional, very often an artist in the film Un ettaro di cielo. He is a traveling salesman who comes in bringing electronic gadgets, speaking about atomic energy to the rural community. So a notion of the economic miracle of Italy moving away from the political rancors of the past and moving away from a sense of economic privation. And this lasts in the 1975 film La Pelle. He plays Curcio Malaparte, so again he plays the artist, plays the novelist, accompanying the American soldiers through liberated Napoli. Of course, accompanying the American soldiers, also accompanying us, the audience. And importantly, someone who is a route to understanding Napoli in that period, but not someone who's one of the starving poor that populates the city. So someone with very fluid, real sense of fluidity, a real sense of mobility. Someone who's able to go through others' worlds, but often remains apart from them. So what is his world? And what I'm arguing is that his world is an interior one. We can see this from many aspects of his acting style. A performance style that asks us to delve inside into his interiority, the soft, modulated voice, something that really stands out extremely clearly, for example, in the film I Soliti Ignoti, the difference in vocal performance that he has to collection of the main comic talents of the late 1950s. The hesitation, the furrowed or downcast brow, the slight restriction that he often has to his smile, or the way in which he often looks away into an undefined middle distance. And I got slightly obsessive in preparing this presentation, but some of the recurrent traits that we see in terms of settings, or in terms of particular motifs in his films, are really very striking. Here's just a few of the bedrooms in which Marcello tends to perform, should we say? And it's not solely a question of the bedroom interior just as the Latin lover, but a notion that we're moving into some interior space in more ways than simply physically the interior. For anyone who's interested, in Divorzo all'Italiana, he spends the most screen time in bed. I thought in Alonso Anfan he appeared in the widest variety of beds, but then I saw Casanova 70, and that one wins for that one. Often it's the first shot of the film. There's we can see Il Bel Antonio, Il Momento Più Bello, and of course Divorzo all'Italiana. Often framed separately from people, so a notion of solitude, and a solitude which draws attention to privacy, and the way in which attention itself is something that is a little difficult. So although we pay attention to his growing fame, it seems to be at some sort of price of solitude and in some kind of conflict with his private self, which remains to the fore. Often looking in mirrors as well, so bringing us a sense, mirror being a reflection really in two senses. Both a reflection brings our gaze to the physical image of the person looking in the mirror, but also a notion that we're reflecting on something that's occurring inside the protagonist. And as well as this, the kind of dramatic material that we have in the films is about what's going on inside Marcello. For example, the way in which it's the awakening of his conscience in Matrimonio all'Italiana. What's the cause of his impotence in Il Bel Antonio? The egoistic drives underneath the performance of a social role in Divorzo all'Italiana. Otto e Mezzo is described as being all about a man's inner confusion. And this isn't just the more prestige or art films. It's something like Casanova 70. Again, it's about his impotence and his need to be in high anxiety situations. Allons enfants, about a revolutionary losing his commitment, and so on. And as well as that, the film's style is very much about bringing us into his mental life. So I mentioned already with the clip from La Fortuna di Essere Donna that he's a figure of identification. He literally holds the photographic apparatus, a camera, in other words. But the amount, not only of dream sequences, there was the panel yesterday, intervention yesterday on oniric aspects of Mastroianni's work, but fantasies, flashbacks, a general invitation into his mental life. And as well as this, oh, there we go, sorry, a few other kind of developments of these different motifs, various films where he's not only in a bed, but also we see him in a bed whilst looking in a mirror, looking in a mirror whilst having a flashback, and lying in a bed after a dream whilst also thinking at the beginning of Otto e Mezzo. He plays frequently himself, so a question of self-reflexivity, the notion that the self is something that we ought to reflect upon and is worthy of our reflection, or the artist, so a strong degree of identification, and in obviously Otto e Mezzo, and also Voyage to the End of the World, playing a director and seemingly a surrogate for the film director. So in short, what I'm arguing is that his persona embodies the self. It embodies the primacy of selfhood, and that this self, this may be considered contentious by some here, but I think that the self is pretty much a new category in post-war Italian cinema, not in post-war Italian culture. We can go back to Pirandello, we can go back to Jacopo Ortis, we can go back to Casanova, that is the memoirs of Casanova and so on, but specifically in Italian cinema, he plays a self, rather than a heroic type, rather than an archetype, rather than simply a comic mask, rather than a social representative, as we might have with neorealism. 5 minutes, okay. He plays a self, I would also say, distinct from a soul, and that seems to be the problem in La Dolce Vita and in Otto e Mezzo. Someone not content with material abundance or social freedoms, nor someone content with the notion of the transcendent being of his soul. He speaks to the eminence in Otto e Mezzo in terms of how his character had a Catholic upbringing which gives certi complessi repressioni. So this is a psychological understanding in developmental terms of Catholicism rather than spiritual and soul. So individual, unique, personal, inner life and self-fashioned, which is why in particular the kinds of films we see in tend to be melodrama, comedy and art house films, and not action films, not the giallo, not realism. There are some examples of neorealismo popolare, but I don't really have time to go into that. This all occurs amidst changing conceptions of the individual, an understanding of one's purpose in life being in relation to oneself, and I'll just, I think, have time to show a quick clip from Le Due Vite di Mattia Pascal. Very, very different in all sorts of ways to the clip I showed from La Fortuna di Essere Donna, but once again, something where we very much identify with Marcello. It's being told in first person, he's narrating to us. We actually have point of view shots, and once again, it's a question of the mobility or the fluidity of the self. It's the moment at which he decides to leave his old life, and in fact he takes on a new life. Point of view shot there.
Certo che affiancarsi in acqua in una notte gelida come quella era dura, anche per uno stanco della vita. Ed è oltretutto già bagnato. Meglio buttarsi sotto un treno.
Anyway, best move quite quickly on. The flowing waters, the moving train. I mean, he decides actually just to jump on the train and begins his new life. But all the notion of the transitory aspects of the outer circumstances of life, and it's the self which persists beyond that. What, just by way of conclusion, what this selfhood means for a construction of the post-war Italian self-image. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Construction of the post-war Italian self-image. Well, firstly, that the mass media and film media, the way in which it entered into Italian life in the post-war period, the understanding of oneself as being something in a process of transformation. Particularly a film like Il Bel Antonio or Divorzo all'Italiana is an understanding of the way in which the honor codes, the way in which certain images to live up to are no longer fit. So they're still present, but they act as a dead weight. They act as the trappings which hold the wants or desires of the main character back in one way or another. He gave a selfhood to Italian style, fashion, and fame, and for many, as has been mentioned, came to personify the economic miracle. As I've said, mobility, a sense of achievement, and of renown, also a faith in progress, I would say, very much there in La Dolce Vita, and in films, the way in which he appears pretty much as himself in C'eravamo tanto amati and Intervista. He represents the entire economic miracle of the post-war period, and then also of its decline, perhaps the social decline of Italy, or at the very least, a notion of the decline of Italian cinema from its golden age. So he brings to the fore a conflict with heroic types and the incommensurability of types in general with the self in all of its complexity. It's the self which provides definition of the protagonist, which is a vehicle for his internal life, and this is gendered, this is male, and which is the dramatic subject. So in a sense, it's actually types which are inadequate to the selfhood that is on display and which he's developed throughout his persona. I think this somewhat modifies the question of crisis that's been discussed, because it does point to the endurance of a male subject as the universal position of identification, and a certain confidence enough to withstand transformations wrought on it. If I can maybe just go 1 minute for the last few sentences. Thank you. There is still, I would say, a fragility, finally, to this notion of the self. Firstly, the way in which, in films like Ginger and Fred, it brings up the importance to male selfhood of performance, the importance to male selfhood of showing off. And then, as well as that, the fact that this self renders all else superficial. Everything is insatiably referred to the self, and yet the self itself is insubstantial. If it forms our essence, it's nevertheless something that has no real existence. This can be played comedically for the silliness that it has to it. It can be played melodramatically for, yes, the melancholia that can be attached to it. But nevertheless, I'd say that it's that notion of selfhood which is important both to understanding his stardom, to understanding the role that he played in the imagination of his star persona, and perhaps in connecting those notions of the inetto, the inadequate, to those simultaneously to that idea of someone who embodied post-war Italian cinema itself.
Thank you very much. And again, I think we're seeing some connections across. Actually, we need to take a break. But I'll just so some connections across, just to perhaps be thinking about when we just take a break momentarily. The question, for instance, of this notion of the self, how does that relate to these notions of melancholia that have been coming up? Interesting, the question of the spectator, which very much related to what Veronica thought was very striking, that the clip you showed was of him being a spectator, and that's an interesting link with the first paper. And then just something you put on the map, iconic of what? And perhaps with that stop, we will now take a quarter of an hour's break. Thank you.
18
25-2. We'll meet again at 11:35. You've got time to find your way around the